The mountains were already holding their breath when autumn arrived. Fog didn't drift through Wise County in 1921. It settled. It pooled low in the hollows, wrapped itself around tree trunks, and pressed against cabin walls like it was listening. At dawn, the ridgelines vanished entirely, swallowed by a gray veil that blurred the line between earth and sky. Sound behaved strangely there. A snapped twig could echo like a footstep. A voice could travel farther than it should, or not at all. High above the last dependable road, past trails that dissolved into mud and leaf rot, stood a cabin most maps didn't bother to mark. Locals didn't point to it. They tilted their heads toward the slope and said, "Up there." Before we step deeper into this story, where are you watching from? It's strange how far tales like this travel. In those years, the Appalachian Mountains weren't romantic. They were practical and unforgiving. Life here depended on coal seams, corn rows, and the understanding that help did not arrive quickly. Winters killed the unprepared. Illness traveled faster than doctors. And the law, when it came at all, arrived after the damage was done. Isolation wasn't an inconvenience. It was a condition of survival. That isolation shaped people, hardened them, bent them in quiet ways no one noticed until it was too late. And no one embodied that quiet bending more than Maribel Carter. She was 32 when whispers began to gather around her name, though they'd followed her long before that. Widowed young, childless, and living alone in a region where none of those things were forgiven easily, Maribel did not fit the narrow expectations carved out for women in the mountains. She walked alone. She spoke plainly. She negotiated business face-to-face with men who didn't like being challenged. Her hair was always pulled into a severe bun, dark and precise. Her posture was rigid, her gaze direct. She didn't flirt. She didn't apologize. And she didn't pretend to be small. To some, that made her admirable. To most, it made her unsettling. Maribel's cabin sat on the highest slope in the county, wrapped in ancient hardwoods that formed a natural wall. The trees were so dense they blocked sunlight even at midday. Few people ever climbed that far and fewer stayed long. Those who did reported the same sensations. A pressure behind the eyes, a chill that lingered even near the hearth, a sense that the place was occupied, even when it wasn't. Lantern light flickered in the windows at odd hours. Voices carried downhill on nights without wind. Dogs refused to go near the trail. At first, it was dismissed as mountain imagination, the kind born from long nights and little company. Then people started to disappear. Not locals, not families with roots, travelers, men passing through with packs on their backs and letters in their pockets, merchants, traders, preachers, people whose absence could be delayed, explained away, ignored until it couldn't. The first sign came quietly, as these things often do. A farmer named Thomas Belmont noticed wagon tracks near the upper trail, fresh, deep, and repeated. Too many for a woman who supposedly lived alone. He also mentioned a smell drifting downhill on warm afternoons. Sour, rotting, indescribable. It made his stomach turn, though he couldn't explain why. Sheriff Harold Pritchard listened patiently, and did nothing. Maribel Carter had always been the subject of gossip. Pritchard had heard it all before. The lights, the voices, the stories whispered over drinks. None of it had ever amounted to proof. And in 1921, proof was expensive, time-consuming, and often dangerous to pursue. A week later, a woman named Estelle Monroe arrived at the sheriff's office in tears. Her brother Leonard was a traveling merchant. He sold fabrics, tools, whatever people needed. He wrote home every 10 days without fail. 3 weeks had passed. Then 4. No letters. No sightings. The last anyone knew, he'd been heading into the mountains, toward Maribel Carter's land. The sheriff promised to make inquiries. He still didn't climb the mountain. It wasn't until a group of hunters found a leather pack in a clearing, along with cooking utensils and identification papers bearing Leonard Monroe's name, that the situation shifted from rumor to obligation. At that point, ignoring it was no longer an option. Pritchard gathered 2 deputies and began the ascent. The climb was slow and punishing. Wet leaves slicked the trail. The fog refused to lift. And with every step upward, something became increasingly clear to all three men. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no insects, only the sound of their boots and their breathing. Quick question. How did you find this story? Was it chance? Or something darker pulling you here? When the cabin finally emerged from the trees, it looked smaller than expected. Closed windows, locked door, no smoke from the chimney, but the air around it felt wrong. Not abandoned. Waiting. What the sheriff found inside would change Wise County forever. And if you're still listening, you've already crossed into the part few dare to reach. Follow now, before the story fades again. The door resisted them. Not in a dramatic way, no sudden crash, no splintering wood. Just a stubborn refusal, as if the cabin itself needed time to decide whether it would allow them inside. Sheriff Pritchard tried the handle once more, announced himself again, then nodded to the deputies. One shoulder, one hard push. The lock gave with a dull crack. The smell hit first. It wasn't the sharp stink of rot people expect when something is wrong. It was thicker than that, layered. Old smoke, damp wood, stale food, and beneath it all, something sweet and nauseating that clung to the back of the throat. The interior was dark. Heavy curtains blocked the windows, turning midday into a gray twilight. Pritchard lit his lantern, and the room revealed itself slowly, as if reluctantly. The first impression was ordinary. A table at the center, 2 chairs, a fireplace with ashes still warm enough to suggest recent use, dishes stacked haphazardly in the sink, clothes draped over a chair like someone had stood up and never returned. That was the first thing that didn't make sense. If Maribel Carter had fled, she hadn't done it in a hurry. Papers lay scattered across the table. Not letters but records. Names, dates, amounts written carefully in ink. Business dealings, some legitimate, others vague enough to raise questions. Pritchard recognized several of the names. Locals. People who had no reason to be doing business with a woman who lived this far up the mountain. Still, none of it explained Leonard Monroe. One of the deputies noticed the door at the back of the cabin. It was ajar. Just barely. Pritchard felt it then. That tightening in the chest that comes when instinct speaks before logic can argue. Cellars were common in mountain cabins. Root storage, winter supplies, nothing unusual, except the smell. It grew stronger as he approached the steps. The wood creaked beneath his boots as he descended. Lantern held out in front of him. Each step down carried the weight of something he couldn't yet name. The air grew colder, damper. The sweet note in the odor sharpened into something unmistakably wrong. The cellar was larger than expected. Not a simple storage pit, but a rough chamber carved into the mountain itself. Shelves lined the walls, not with jars of preserves or sacks of grain, but with glass containers filled with dark liquid, wooden boxes sealed with rusted nails, and scattered among them personal belongings. Shoes, hats, pocket watches, rings. Too many. They lay arranged with a care that bordered on reverence, like offerings rather than discarded items. Pritchard called the deputies down. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Among the items was a leather wallet. Inside, identification papers belonging to Leonard Monroe. That was the moment the investigation stopped being a search and became a reckoning. Quick question. How did you find this story? Was it chance? Or something darker pulling you here? As they continued cataloging what they saw, the scope of it became clear. These weren't random objects. They belonged to different people, different times. Some names were familiar, travelers who had passed through the region years earlier and were never seen again. A deputy found a diary hidden beneath folded fabric. The handwriting was elegant, controlled. Maribel Carter's. The earliest entries spoke of hardship, of isolation, of being judged and shut out by the community below. She wrote of money troubles, of anger, of a sense that the world had turned its back on her. Then the tone shifted. She began writing about opportunities, about people who passed through and would not be missed, about survival at any cost. The most recent entries were vague, almost deliberately so. Mentions of dinners, of storms that forced travelers to stay the night, of negotiations that ended without witnesses. Pritchard closed the diary slowly. This wasn't a single mistake. It was a pattern. As they prepared to leave, one deputy noticed marks in the dirt floor. Deep grooves, worn into the earth, leading toward a section of the stone wall that didn't quite match the rest. Loose stones, recently disturbed. They pried them free. What lay behind them removed all doubt. This cabin was not just a home. It was a grave. By the time they sealed the place and began the descent, word was already spreading through the valleys. Fear travels fast in the mountains. Faster than truth. Faster than mercy. Maribel Carter was gone. And now everyone wanted to know the same thing. Was she running? Or was she watching? Don't go quiet yet. The next whisper in the dark is almost here. By the time the sheriff and his deputies reached the bottom of the slope, the mountain had already begun to speak. Word moved through Wise County the way it always did, not by announcement but by absence. A shopkeeper closed early. A preacher rewrote his sermon. Mothers pulled children indoors before dusk. Men gathered in quiet knots along porches and storefronts, speaking in low voices that stopped when strangers passed. The cabin above the fog was no longer a rumor. It was a certainty. Sheriff Pritchard returned with more men the next morning. This time, they brought shovels, ledgers, and the unspoken understanding that what they were about to uncover could not be put back once exposed. The climb felt steeper than before, the fog thicker. Even the deputies, hardened by years of accidents and crimes, avoided meeting one another's eyes. When they reopened the hidden wall in the cellar, the mountain gave back what it had been holding. Behind the loose stones was a narrow passage, scarcely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. It sloped downward into the earth, crudely reinforced with timber that had been cut and shaped by hand. The lantern light revealed scratch marks along the walls. Not animal marks, but long, uneven grooves left by fingers. Human fingers. At the end of the passage, they found the chamber. It was not large. It did not need to be. The remains were carefully placed, wrapped in oilcloth and burlap, stacked with an order that suggested time and repetition. No single grave. No attempt at concealment. This was storage the way one might store winter supplies. Each body told the same story in small, damning details. No gunshot wounds. No obvious violence. Instead, signs of poisoning, of prolonged illness, of weakness that came before the end. Meals shared. Trust given. Doors locked from the inside. The deputies worked in silence, documenting what they could, lifting what the mountain allowed them to lift. By midday, the smell had become unbearable. They sealed the chamber again and posted guards, though none of them truly believed guards mattered anymore. Maribel Carter was not there. She had not been buried. She had not left a trail. She had vanished into the same mountains that had protected her for years. As news spread, the community fractured. Some demanded her immediate capture and hanging, trial or no trial. Others, fewer, quieter, asked questions no one wanted to answer. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? How many times had people passed her on the road, exchanged words, shared meals? And what had driven her to it? At the edge of that debate was a deeper, more dangerous question. Do you think Maribel Carter was cursed or chosen? Tell me below. I read every theory. Search parties formed by the end of the week. Men with rifles and dogs moved into the woods, following trails that dissolved as quickly as they appeared. They found signs, broken branches, disturbed soil, places where someone had rested, but nothing definitive. It was as if the mountain itself had decided to keep her. Then came the sightings. A woman matching Maribel's description seen near an abandoned coal road at dusk. Lantern light deep in the trees where no camp should have been. A knock at a farmhouse door after midnight, followed by silence when it was opened. Each report contradicted the last. Each one fed the growing sense that whatever had been unleashed was no longer bound by logic or distance. Sheriff Pritchard listened. He documented. And privately, he wondered whether the law had arrived too late to matter. The mountain had given back its dead. It had not given back its secrets. And if you've made it this far, you're already deeper than most. Subscribe before the next chapter finds you. In the weeks that followed, Maribel Carter became more than a person. She became a shape people filled with their fears. Every account conflicted with the last. Some described her as tall, others slight. Some swore she walked with a limp. Others claimed she moved like someone unburdened, almost weightless. The only consistency was this. Everyone who claimed to see her was certain it had been her, and equally certain she had not wanted to be seen. Sheriff Pritchard recorded the reports in ink, but he filed them in his mind as something else entirely. Confessions without witnesses. The search parties slowed as autumn bled into early winter. Snow made tracking impossible. Food grew scarce. Men returned home to families who needed them more than the hunt did. Gradually, the organized effort dissolved into something quieter, private vigilance. Locked doors. Loaded rifles kept closer at night. And still, the sightings continued. A farmhand swore a woman stood at the tree line while he worked, watching until he noticed her. A traveling preacher claimed a lantern followed him along the ridge for nearly an hour without closing the distance. A widow in Norton insisted someone tried her door just before dawn. Slow, deliberate knocks, as if testing whether the house was truly occupied. None of them could prove it, but none of them slept well afterward. Maribel Carter's diary was read and reread. The sheriff searched for a moment, a turning point where hardship had given way to cruelty. What he found instead was something far more unsettling. There was no sudden break. The entries moved gradually from despair to justification, from hunger to opportunity, from resentment to a quiet certainty that the world owed her what it had denied. She did not write like someone spiraling. She wrote like someone deciding. That realization unsettled the county more than the cellar ever could. Monsters were easier when they were born overnight. This one had been cultivated slowly, by isolation, by indifference, by a system that allowed certain people to disappear without consequence. Some began to speak her name with something close to sympathy, others with outright reverence. She did what she had to, one man muttered in a tavern before being shouted down. That was when the arguments started. Was Maribel a predator? Or a product? Do you think Maribel Carter was cursed? Or chosen? Tell me below, I read every theory. As winter tightened its grip, the sightings grew less frequent but more specific. Always near the same paths. Always near places where travelers might pass through if they were desperate enough. And then, one morning, Sheriff Pritchard received a letter. No return address. No postmark anyone recognized. The paper was cheap. The ink familiar. Contained a single sentence. The mountain keeps what it's given. Pritchard never admitted it publicly, but he knew the handwriting. The search was called off not long after. Officially, Maribel Carter was declared missing. Unconfirmed reports. No body. No arrest. No trial. Unofficially, people stopped climbing that far up the mountain. The cabin was abandoned. Boarded. Left to rot beneath the fog. But abandonment does not mean empty. And if you're still listening, you've heard what others missed. Keep the connection alive, hit subscribe. The letter stayed locked in Sheriff Pritchard's desk for nearly a year. He told himself it was evidence, that it might matter someday. But in quieter moments, late at night, when the courthouse creaked and the lamp oil burned low, he knew the truth. He was afraid of what it confirmed. The handwriting was Maribel Carter's. He had compared it enough times to stop pretending otherwise. The phrasing, too restrained, deliberate, almost formal. Not the words of someone on the run. The words of someone who believed the matter settled. It wasn't until the winter of 1922, during a storm that cut Wise County off from the outside world for 3 days, that the next piece surfaced. A man arrived at the sheriff's door after dark. His name was Elias Boone, a coal hauler from across the county line. He was soaked to the bone, shaking so badly Pritchard thought at first he was ill. It took several minutes before Elias could speak clearly enough to be understood. He said he had stayed the night in the cabin. Not recently, the year before. At first, Pritchard assumed shock or drink. But Elias hadn't been traveling when the disappearances peaked. His name hadn't appeared on any list. He had never come forward, and when Pritchard asked why, the man's eyes filled with something worse than fear. Shame. Elias explained that his wagon had broken an axle late one afternoon. Snow had begun to fall early that year. He followed a lantern light he saw on the ridge and found the cabin. Maribel answered the door without surprise, as if she'd been expecting him. She fed him warm stew, bread, tea that tasted faintly bitter. They spoke very little. She wasn't cruel, Elias said. She wasn't kind either. Just decided. That night he woke unable to move, his limbs heavy, his mouth dry, panic blooming slowly, like something underwater. Maribel stood over him with the lantern, watching, measuring. She told him the truth then, that she had learned how much poison a man could take without dying quickly, that hunger had taught her patience, that the mountain rewarded those who listened long enough. And then, for reasons she never explained, she let him live. By morning, Elias could move again. His wagon was repaired, his supplies untouched. She walked him to the trailhead and told him not to come back. Some people, she said, are worth more gone than dead. Elias kept her secret, not out of loyalty, but because he believed the mountain would punish him if he didn't. As he finished his confession, the wind howled outside the sheriff's office, rattling the windows like fingers searching for a latch. Pritchard wrote every word down. But when Elias asked what would happen next, the sheriff had no answer. There would be no arrest, no trial, no closure. The law required a body, and the mountain was done giving. Do you think Maribel Carter was cursed? Or chosen? Tell me below. I read every theory. When Elias left, Pritchard burned the letter in his desk drawer. Not to erase it, to free himself from it. In the spring, travelers returned cautiously to the mountain roads. Life resumed in the careful, guarded way it always does after something terrible refuses to end cleanly. But some habits never returned. People knocked before entering homes. Lanterns were extinguished earlier. And no one followed lights in the woods anymore. Because some confessions are not meant to bring justice. They are meant to warn. And if you're still here, then you already feel it. The next part is closer than you think. There was never a trial for Maribel Carter. No courtroom arguments. No witnesses sworn in. No verdict read aloud. But Wise County judged her all the same. Slowly, unevenly, in conversations held behind closed doors and sermons delivered without names. The sheriff called a public hearing in the spring of 1923. Officially, it was to address safety on the mountain roads. Unofficially, it was a reckoning. People filled the benches with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with procedure. They wanted an ending, or at least something shaped like one. Sheriff Pritchard laid out the facts that could be proven. The cabin, the cellar, the remains, the missing. He avoided speculation. He avoided the letter. He avoided Elias Boone's confession entirely. When he finished, the room sat in silence. Then the arguments began. Some demanded the cabin be burned to the ground. Others insisted it be sealed and left alone, that disturbing it further would only invite more trouble. A few voices, quieter but persistent, asked how long Maribel had asked for help before the mountain became her answer. That question did not land well. It forced the room to consider something uncomfortable, that her crimes had flourished in the absence of attention, that travelers were easy to ignore because they belonged nowhere, that isolation was not just a circumstance, it was a policy. The judge overseeing the hearing finally spoke. Without a body, without a living suspect, the case would remain open in name only. The deaths would be recorded. The mountain roads would be monitored. And Maribel Carter would be listed as missing, presumed dead. It was the cleanest ending the law could manage. Outside the courthouse, opinions hardened into folklore. Parents warned children about lantern lights. Travelers were advised to pass through quickly or not at all. The mountain acquired a reputation that maps could not erase. Years passed. The cabin collapsed under snow and rot. The trees reclaimed the clearing. Trails shifted. But stories lingered, passed down with small changes. A woman in black, a watcher in the fog, a light that appeared only to the desperate. Some said Maribel died in the winter, alone and satisfied. Others insisted she lived for years, moving ridge to ridge, leaving no trace. A few believed the mountain itself took her, not as punishment but as payment. If you've made it this far, you're already deeper than most. Subscribe before the next chapter finds you. Today, Wise County looks different. The roads are paved. The forests thinned. Cell service reaches places that once swallowed people whole. But the mountains haven't changed. They still hold fog the same way. They still go quiet at the wrong moments. And some stories still surface when the conditions are right. Hikers report the smell of old smoke where no fire has burned. Hunters speak of trails that seem to rearrange themselves. And every so often, someone claims to see a light high on the ridge. Steady, deliberate, never approaching. Always watching. What makes the story endure is not the violence. It's the recognition, the understanding that Maribel Carter was not born from myth, but from circumstance. From isolation sharpened into resolve. From a world that looked away long enough for something unspeakable to feel justified. That does not excuse her, but it explains why the story refuses to fade. Folklore survives because it carries instruction. Don't trust the wrong kindness. Don't ignore the forgotten. Don't assume the mountain is empty just because it's quiet. And above all, don't follow the light unless you're prepared to stay. The cabin above the fog is gone now. But the place where it stood still feels heavier than the rest of the slope. Animals avoid it. Sound bends strangely there. And those who linger too long report the same sensation people described a century ago. Not fear. Recognition. The mountain remembers what it's given. And it remembers who listened. Don't close the page yet. The legend isn't finished with you. This story came from fragments of real folklore. If it stayed with you, share it. And thank you for keeping old legends alive.